All right, so we're working on 1.5, which is adding real numbers. When you hear the term real numbers, we're talking about adding basically positive and negative numbers. The first thing we got to kind of cover when it comes to that is you're going to hear the term absolute value a lot, that you're combining their absolute values or subtracting their absolute values. And absolute values will look like these brackets right here, these straight brackets. So this is the absolute value of -3 in these straight brackets, absolute value of 0, absolute value of 5. And the actual definition of absolute value is how far a number is from 0, or the distance that number is from 0. And the one thing to keep in mind about distance in general, distance is always going to be a positive value. So your absolute value will never be a negative. So even if we're doing, say, the absolute value of -3, well, how far is -3 from 0? It's 3 places away from 0. And that's the same. Normally, we don't get that one wrong. Where we start to make mistakes is if it's a positive number. So what is the absolute value? How far is 5 from 0? Well, it's 5. It's not -5. It's just the distance in general is 5. All right. So again, absolute value will always be whatever the number is, the positive value of that number. And when you talk about 0, well, how far is 0 from 0? And that would be 0. One thing to keep in mind when we're talking about or order of operations, absolute values have the same effect as a parentheses. So in other words, absolute value, just like with parentheses, parentheses is always what we do first. When we're dealing with absolute values would also always be done first. So just keep that in mind. There's a couple problems that deal with absolute value. And when we get to the slides, you'll hear, adding and subtracting the absolute values. So that takes me kind of to the most important slide that you will see on the PowerPoint is this one right here. And for now, let's ignore the subtracting part. That's what we'll get to when we do 1.6. But when you are adding integers, so you're adding numbers with positive and negative values, the rule is you're going to ask yourself, it's going to be one or two things. Either the signs are the same, which means either they're both positive or both negative, or when we're adding two numbers, their signs are different, which means one's positive, one's negative. Okay, so if the signs are the same, what you do is you add their absolute value and you keep the sign. So in other words, if they're both negative, you would add the numbers together and keep the negative sign. If they're both positive, obviously you add the two positive numbers together and keep that sign. If the signs are different, what you're going to do is subtract. So when we say subtract the absolute value, just pick whatever the bigger number is, subtract from the smaller number, and then you keep the sign of the number with the greatest absolute value. So in other words, you're going to look, is there more positives or more negatives? If there's more positives, then your answer will be positive. If there's more negatives, then your answer will be negative. So this will make a lot more sense as we start to do examples. But again, this is, I think on the PowerPoint, this slide will pop up a couple times because it's that important. But that's basically how I teach, adding these integers. So let's get into some examples. First one, you got a -3 being added to a -8. So again, we're going to ask ourselves, are these signs the same or are they different? In other words, what do we have? We have a -3 added to a -8. Can you both all agree that these signs are both negative? So they're the same sign. They just happen to be negative. Well, the rule states if the signs are the same, you add the absolute values. So the absolute value of -3 would be 3. The absolute value of -8 would be 8. So in other words, you're adding, what is 3 plus 8? 3 plus 8 would be 11. But again, what the rule says, you add their absolute values, but you keep the sign. In other words, since they're both negative, our answer is also a negative value. So you're gonna, if the signs are the same, you add them. Is really the way you add them and keep the sign is really how I teach it. Let's go to another example. Okay, so we have a positive 10. Again, you know it's positive because you don't see you're not going to write a plus here. You just got to know that if there's not a negative in front of it, it's a positive. So we're going 10 plus negative 3. Positive number and a negative number. That tells me that these signs are different. The rule is when they're different, you subtract them. And I'm going to subtract, you're talking to absolute value. So it's basically 10 take away 3. So again, what's 10 minus 3? The answer is 7. And then we got to figure out, is that a positive 7 or a negative 7? Which is there more of? Is there more positives here or more negatives? Okay, so if they were in a war together and these were you had 10 positives and 3 negatives, who's more, who's going to win? The 10 positives, right? The 10 positives, there's more positives, so our answer would be positive. You don't have to write a plus 7. Your answer is just positive 7. So again, they take that same same type of problem, but they're going to put it now in fractions, and I'm going to write it vertically. We're going to notice our LCDs are different. This goes back to, what was it, 1.4. We need to come up with our common denominator, and we'll notice that it'll be 25. I'm not going to have to do anything for this top one, so this is just going to be negative 17 over 25. Bottom one, I'm going to have to multiply 5 to the top and the bottom to get to that 25. All right, we keep 25 there. So the question, what we're doing here is we're taking a negative 17 and we're adding it to a positive 5. Are the signs the same or different? One's negative, one's positive, so there's different. So the rule is you subtract. What's 17 take away 5? 17 take away 5 would be 12. And then I got to ask, is it going to be a positive 12 or a negative 12? I got 17 negatives, but only 5 positives. So what is there more of? There's definitely more negatives. So our answer here would be negative 12. Do another example with fractions. Okay, so the first thing we want to do before we really worry about these positive or negative signs, coming up with our LCD, we got 16 and 8. So our LCD is going to be 16 because 8 will go into 16. I'm not going to have to do anything up here because I'm not changing it. So I just got to move the negative 7 over. How is that 8 going to turn into 16? I got to multiply 2, multiply 2. So negative 5 times 10. Again, we haven't really, we'll talk about multiplying integers. Sometimes they expect you to know some things, but a negative 5 times a positive 2 gives me a negative 10. So then my rule is what am I doing? I'm adding 2 numbers that are both negative. So that means their signs, are they the same or different? They're both the same. If the signs are the same, we're adding. So what's 10 plus 7? That'll give me 17. And again, you keep the sign. If they're both positive, it would stay positive. If they're both negative, it also stays negative. Okay, and these are rules. Some of you are going to say, well, I thought a negative and negative is a positive. That is when we were multiplying. So right now we're not multiplying. We are adding these real numbers. So these are rules when you're adding. So it's important that we do not get confused with our rules and just focus on what you're doing right now. These are the rules when you're adding. When you're adding real numbers, if the signs are the same, you keep that sign and add it. If the signs are different, like up here, we subtract them and keep the bigger sign. Our next example here is just going to be, we're just going to follow our order of operations, and we don't have parentheses, we don't have exponents, we're not multiplying or dividing. So how do we add? We add going left to right. So the first thing we would do is negative 18 plus 9. These signs are different, correct? One's negative, one's positive. So the rule is subtract. What's 18? Take away 9. That'll give me 9. And is it positive or negative? Again, there's more negatives in the 18 than there are in the 9, so our answer is negative 9. Now I'm going to move this down. Okay, so this would obviously be the next thing we do. We are taking a negative 9 and adding it to negative 4. Are the signs the same or different? Signs are the same. The rule is when they're the same, you add. 9 plus 4 would give me 13. And again, since they are both negative, our answer is also negative. They do give you an absolute value problem here with on this section. It looks like this. Again, we know absolute value because they're straight. They're not a curve. See the difference here with the curve parentheses? We have straight, which tells us we're doing absolute value. So again, even though this is a fraction, since we have these absolute values, we have to, again, they're like parentheses, we do this first. So in other words, you're going to ignore the negative sign out in front. And we're going to say, what is the answer? What is the absolute value of negative 2 over 13? Remember, we talked about it doesn't matter what the value is, whether it's positive or negative, our answer will always be positive. So negative 2 over 13 is the same distance away from 0 as 2 over 13. So the absolute value of negative 2 over 13 is just 2 over 13. At this point, we're going to bring that negative into it. So it makes our answer, it actually makes our answer negative. And that sometimes throws people off because they're like, oh, I thought absolute value is always positive. Correct. But remember, since that negative is out front here, the absolute value of this is a positive value. But remember, we have that, it's basically like a negative 1 that's being multiplied to that answer. So that's positive, and then we take that negative value. And you're going to see these types of situations a lot in this course, where they throw a negative in front of something, which means, again, you would always do whatever's over here first sometimes, and then you're going to apply that negative value to it. So just keep that in mind. There's another example, same concept, really. You do the absolute value of negative 10 over 13, that gives me a positive 10 over 13. But then you're applying this negative to that. So our answer becomes negative 10 over 13. So just hopefully you guys understand that. Last example, again, I'm trying to cover at least one of everything you're going to see on 1.5. And again, the reminder is when you start these lessons, the first thing I'd like you guys to do is go through the PowerPoint. Just get a little brush up of what you're going to see. And then if you want to attempt the lesson, you could definitely do that. And then if you get stuck, then obviously you may want to go to the videos because I will, like I said, I will try to do at least one example of what you'll see in this section. Try to do that. If you still have problems, obviously, you want to join me in my office hours, and I can kind of help you guys kind of in a one-on-one setting, depending how many people are on there. But we can go around and take questions, and I can do examples for you guys there. All right, so is negative 7 a solution of x plus 9 equals 2? So what they're asking you here is, again, if you substitute negative 7 where x is, does this give me 2? So the way we kind of solve these is I write parentheses where the x is, or the missing variable that I'm going to substitute. And in this case, I'm substituting the negative 7. Okay, so follow your rules of adding real numbers. Are these signs the same or different? So hopefully you'll look and say they're different. One's negative, one's positive, right? They are not the same sign. They're not both negative. They're not both positive. They're different. The rule when they're different is you subtract their absolute values. So in other words, we're going to go 9, take away 7. 9 take away 7 gives me 2. And the question is that a positive 2 or a negative 2? Okay, well, we've got to look. There's 7 negatives, but there's 9 positives. What is there more of? There's more positives, right? So our answer would be positive. So in other words, they're asking you, does 2 equal 2? Yes, it does. 2 does equal 2. So that means -7, yes, is a solution of x plus 9 is equal to 2. And that's pretty much 1.5. In the next section, we're going to talk about subtracting real numbers, which is one really small thing different than adding, because basically subtracting is, you'll learn, is basically adding. And we'll talk about that when we on the video for 1.6.